Allie with Potomac Beads. Join me in creating these linear earrings featuring some tubular herringbone stitch and the addition of a couple crystals. Gather up your supplies, and if you happen to need any, check out the links below to shop with us online. Go ahead and get them and we'll get started. For this linear earring, we are going to be working with tubular herringbone stitch. We're working with 2 rows of tubular herringbone stitch, and afterward we're going to embellish on top with our 1.5 by 2 millimeter crystals. I have all the ingredients here that I'll be using to make these, including 11 Delicas in the matte metallic dark bronze, followed by 3 1.5 millimeter by 2 millimeter Potomac Crystal Rondelles. I'm going for that nice ombre look, and these can be as long or as short as you want them to be. I also have an antique brass leverback as well as some wire guards in that antique brass. You can again make these as long or as short as you want, one color or multicolor. I'm using the chrysolite, the seafoam green, and the Pacific green to work and get that ombre effect. I'm going to be using a total of 6 between the 2 pairs of earrings of the chrysolite, 6 of the seafoam, and then 8 of the Pacific opal. Again, you can do this all with one color if you like, as well as some 11 seed beads rather than delicas. I also have, because of the color of them, 0.006 wildfire beading thread in the green color. And you're going to use about 4 feet between the 2 earrings. Go ahead and add that at one time. That way you do not need to rethread your needle when you are done with one sample. So I'm starting by adding a stop bead, this red bead, onto the end of my thread, and I'm working with a size 10 needle. 10, 11, or 12 will work for this project. I've gone through that stop bead once, and I'm going to go through twice. I'm going to start my herringbone stitch at the top, and then we'll work our way back up after we do our embellishments. To begin, I want to add 1 and 2 of my delica beads onto my thread and needle. Let them drop down next to that stop bead. Sew back through bead number 1 from the stop bead toward the top of the bead between beads 1 and 2. We're going to do a series of 4 beads that are ladder stitched together to create the start of our herringbone stitch. Coming out of that bead there, I want you to add 1 more bead, and this time you're going to go into that first bead again as well. So rather than doing traditional ladder stitch where we're going over to the end, we're going to add 1 to one side and 1 to the other. From here, I want you to sew back through that second bead that you just added toward the stop bead, and then add 1 more bead. Coming out the bottom of that bead, you're going to sew another bead onto it and go into the top of that bead. Sew that nice and tightly on there, and you'll come out through the top. Once you're out through the top there, you have your 4 beads of your ladder stitch on, and we're going to make this into a tubular shape. With my thread currently coming out the top or on the opposite side of the stop bead, I'm going to take my thread and needle from the top of bead number 4 down through the top of bead number 1. I'm then going to go back into the bottom of bead number 4 and back up toward the top. And a nice tight pull. That sets me up here that I have 4 beads that are sandwiched right next to one another and have the holes facing forward. This is going to be 2 groupings or 2 rows of our herringbone stitch that sit to the front and the back. To start the herringbone, and I have lots of videos on herringbone stitch if you want to learn tubular herringbone, you're going to be adding 2 beads at a time. We're coming out bead number 1 here, and we're going to sew down through bead number 2. So 2 beads go on, out bead 1 to the top, down bead number 2. And those beads are going to sit on an angle next to one another. Going on to bead number 3, I want to sew up bead number 3, which sits currently at the back of the design. And once I'm up bead number 3, I'm going to add 2 more beads. I'm going to rotate it around so you can see. I'm up bead number 3, I add 2 beads, and then I'm going to sew down through bead number 4. Sewing down through bead number 4 then, that adds 4 new beads to the top, 2 groups of 2. Going back over to the starting side, I'm going to sew up through bead number 1 in that original group of 4, and also through bead number 1 of that first herringbone section that I just added. That is my step up. After adding 4 beads every time I'm going to do that step up and sew through 2 beads. Coming out of bead number 1 now on row 2, I'm going to add 2 beads and sew down through bead number 2. Give a nice tight pull, make sure your beads are sitting correctly. You're going to spin your project and sew up through bead number 3 of that previous row. Add 2 more beads and sew down bead number 4 of the previous row. It's always going to look like it's disjointed when you're working with herringbone stitch until you come back and add in the next row. I'm coming out bead number 4 and I'm going to sew back into bead number 1 and then also up through the first bead in row 3 that I just completed. Once again, I'll do it slowly here. We're going to add 4 beads and then do our step up. So 2 beads get added coming out of bead number 1 and sew down bead number 2. Then to do our tubular step, I'm going to sew up bead number 3, add 2 more beads, and sew down through bead number 4. When you sew down bead number 4, before going in and creating the 5th row, you're going to sew into bead number 1 from the 3rd row, as well as up through the first bead that you just added in that 4th row. That is how we're going to do our tubular herringbone stitch. You're going to continue this tubular herringbone stitch for about an inch to get your total number of your herringbone rows. If you're going to make it longer, obviously you're going to continue with your herringbone stitch in a longer fashion. Once you're done 20 rows of your herringbone stitch, longer if you want it to be longer, you just want to make sure that you're doing an even amount of these herringbone stitch. We're going to establish our front and our back. Grabbing my darkest bead, which is that Pacific crystal color, I'm coming out of the bottom of my 20th row, and I'm coming out of bead number 1 of row 20. I add on a crystal, and I sew down bead number 2 of row 20. Going into bead 3 of row 20, sewing up bead 3 to the back side, I'm just going to add 1 more delica to finish off what would be the 21st row. Sew down through bead number 4, and then just like normal, go over and sew up through my 1 delica bead, the first one, like I'm getting ready to kind of step up, but I'm not going to sew through the crystal there. What we're going to do instead is herringbone makes this nice row here of thread passes or bridge threads to go from one to the other. Rather than include it in the middle, I really wanted these to stick out the front, almost looking like gemstones on a bezel set piece. To do so, we're going to go underneath our bridge threads to add our crystals. On the outside here, my thread's coming out. I'm going to take my thread and go underneath and out from the bridge thread from row 19. So you see that bridge thread there, it's the first one that you'll be able to see. You're going to sew out through it. You'll see a tiny bit of the green thread, but really not much at all. You want to make sure you're on the front side as well as you're doing this. Add your next Pacific bead here, and you're going to sew through the third, under the 3rd bridge thread. So I'm currently underneath the 1st. I'm going to skip the 2nd, and I'm going to sew underneath the 3rd. And what that's going to do is kind of lock this bead in place, so that way it sits right on the front of the herringbone stitch. You could do this to the back of the design as well if you wanted to, and see how it just sits right nicely down there and decorates the bottom. Coming out under the 3rd one, I want you to add another bead, skip over the 4th, and sew underneath that 5th bridge thread. Now I'm going to continue this pattern the whole way up my herringbone line, adding in 1 bead, skipping over the next bridge thread, and sewing underneath the one following. So again, I'm coming out of 5, I'm going to skip 6 and sew through 7, adding my final one of my Pacific. Then I'm going to go in and add 3 of my seafoam, and then I'm going to add 3 of that chrysolite to finish then toward the top of the design. If you want it to be longer, again, you'll just extend that herringbone line longer to make more of a long, chunky statement piece. As you're adding in your final bead here, you're coming out through that bridge thread between beads 1 and 2 at the top. You'll see how nicely those sit across from one another. And now what I'm going to do is add my wire guard. I've chosen to add my wire guard to the front of the piece. So when I'm looking down at the piece, it's sitting toward the front with the back area open. You're just going to need one more of your delica beads. So I'm going to grab out one more here since I cleaned up my area. And your wire guard. I'm not going to add the ear wire right away. This was a question on another video. I like to open it up and add it after the fact so it's not in the way as I'm sewing. Coming out through that bridge thread, I want to sew now through the bead on the right-hand side. Coming out that bead on the right, go ahead and grab your wire guard or your wire guardian. If you want to, you can also put an 8/0 seed bead there and put a jump ring in between that 8/0 seed bead. I'm going to go around the wire guardian, around that little kidney shape or that horseshoe shape area, down the second shaft portion of the wire guard, and then I'm going to come down through the bead on the left-hand side. So it would be bead number 1 of that herringbone stitch. That puts the wire guard on. I'm going to go into the back here, so up through bead number 3, coming out the back of the herringbone stitch. I'm going to add one of my delica beads, so down through bead number 2, so almost just topping off the herringbone stitch like we did at the bottom. From there then, we're going to go back and reinforce our piece. So move that stop bead out of the way. We'll tie on to that after. I'm going to go back up through bead number 1 here on the herringbone stitch, around through the wire guard, up through that tube on the side, down through on the other side, making sure that your thread stays inside the U channel at the top of the wire guard. You always want to make sure it's going to stay in there for you. Once you have it up there and right inside, going to the back, we're going to go up through bead number 3 on the back of our herringbone row, through the bead that you just added at the top, and then a nice simple end, since there's not a ton of tension here, at the end of our linear earring, you're just going to take off your stop bead that you added. You should have enough thread and needle on your piece to do your second one. You're just going to tie those 2 thread ends off. Now I have not cut the thread down at all because I'll take my thread and needle and separate out these thread ends by taking my thread and needle after that knot and sewing down into the herringbone stitch just a tiny bit along that angle in the back. And then grab my thread zap and burn down my thread ends along my piece. Now you can do this that it's reversible and you have it on both sides of the piece. That's up to you. All you need to do now is go in and add your ear wire by taking a needle nose or a bent needle nose pliers, opening up the ear wire by pushing to the side rather than pulling back on that open ring. Slide it on so it's facing toward the front, and close up that ear wire to complete that nice long linear look. If you want it again a little bit longer or a little bit chunkier, you can also do this with 8/0 seed beads and bigger crystals too. I love the simplicity of it and just that nice bezel set vintage look with the antique brass. Thanks so much for joining me and creating these fun linear earrings. They would even look great with a little tassel at the bottom, or I'd love to see them if somebody wants to make them about 3 inches long, hanging down nice and simple on the neck. Remember, if you do need any supplies, you can check out the links below to shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. Keep in mind too, it's great to see other designs in our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making if you want to become a member there. You can also subscribe so you don't miss anything from us here at Potomac Beads, any product launches, new videos, or inspirational ideas. Remember too to give a little thumbs up and comment below any questions, any answers, and any ideas that you may have to help grow this amazing beading community. As always, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you learned a little and you make tons of pairs of your linear earrings.